All right, so let's open with the main question. The title of your piece is Learning from Incidents is Not the Goal, and it feels a little curious given that learning from incidents is actually a key part of Incident IO. So, what's the story behind it?
Yeah, I guess like a slightly provocatively titled piece, but not a piece that was written to be provocative, if that makes sense. I think it's honestly born a little bit out of like frustration I have around the kind of hot topic of learning from incidents. And it was written originally after I'd gone to a string of like talks about incidents and learning and all these sorts of things. And I came away from those talks honestly just like I don't really understand anything that I've heard, and of the things that I understand, I am struggling to think how I would actually put them into practice when I go back to work on Monday and I have to deal with all the things that I have to do in my job alongside all of the kind of the stuff that's being positioned as this sort of like advancing the field of like learning from incidents. So yeah, a little bit born out of that, and basically like my sort of view on how we can be a little bit more connected to like the fact that we are actually all trying to do a job, and that at the end of the day there is a company behind the scenes that's paying for us to do our job, and that company has to maintain its service or compete against competitors, and all of those things are super important. So when sort of learning is positioned at the goal, I think you end up in this slightly academic world where it's sort of thought about absent the constraints of like what it actually means to be part of a broader business.
Your blog post talks about the gap between theory and practice. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I guess like I would consider myself a bit of like an incident nerd. So have read a reasonable amount around the subject, sort of over many years now. Used to run infrastructure and reliability at a bank, and so this was like super insightful, super useful for me to be able to think about this stuff and try and push things forward a little bit there. But I think again, like genuinely just struggled a lot of the time with sort of taking what I was reading, and although it was like sounded great and sounded incredibly useful, just like trying to apply that stuff to like the day to day of like actually trying to like do my job was just very difficult. And maybe a good example here is like safety one versus safety two, which I read a paper on and I was like, oh my God, this is like amazing. And so sort of, I guess to catch you up, like it's a sort of a theory around like safety science, and so safety one is sort of all sort of like the old school way of looking at things, sort of in inverted commas, where it's like how do we prevent failure, how do we have process that helps us to sort of keep things on the straight and narrow, how do we find and fix errors, generally sort of like a reactive sort of response to incidents and things going wrong. So that's sort of what I think most people will be familiar with when they think about like safety and incidents. It's sort of like something goes wrong, I have processes in place and I try and make sure it doesn't happen again. Or if it does happen again, it's less severe, that kind of thing. And then you got safety two, and it's sort of like positioned to this new way of thinking about things. And it looks at like, most of the time things aren't going wrong, they're going right. And they're probably going right because there's a bunch of things that people are doing day to day to make sure that they go right. And so it sort of focuses on like understanding how people work. It takes like a more proactive approach to sort of like looking at how people are doing their job, and then sort of seeks to try and like dial up those things, or at least like preserve those things, so that you make sure that as many things as possible go right, rather than the other view, which is like make as few things as possible go wrong. Anyway, I think it's really interesting. I look at it and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And then I went back to work and I was like, I don't think I have any clue how I would possibly like operationalize that. And I think this, I use the sort of the draw the rest of the fucking owl in the blog post, and I think that's generally the kind of theme that I get from the kind of the advanced side of the sort of the park to people trying to actually do the job. It's like it's kind of easy to position these things that sort of sound good, sound virtuous, or sound like they should work, but there doesn't seem to be enough, I don't think, being done to kind of meet people where they are and actually sort of solve the challenges that people are facing on an actual day to day basis.
You work with a ton of different companies at Incident IO. Is we're not learning from incidents a common issue that they raise?
Yeah, I think it is a pretty common thing that people come to us with. So um, I think what's interesting is when folks say we want to use Incident.io because we're not adequately learning from incidents. In many cases, that's true that they're not learning from incidents, but sort of not necessarily for the reasons they think. So I think a lot of the time people conflate like learning from incidents with I run a meeting after a severe incident, and then I write up a document that I feel really proud of and I share, and if I've done those things, then we're learning, and if I haven't done those things, then we're not learning. And I think that's a little bit of a kind of reductive view. So if I look at like how I think learning happens, I think that is one angle. That is kind of I don't know. I kind of call this like active learning. So it's like we're doing a bunch of things to sort of promote learning across the organization. So getting people together in a room, writing an artifact that we can then take and we can share across the organization. Like very sort of active. I'm doing things. But there is like learning that happens everywhere that is like basically impossible to avoid. So if you take, for example, an incident that's being run in a public Slack channel, the people who are in that incident, they're learning probably faster than they've learned anything for a long time. You're often presented with things that you've never seen before, and so you have to get very good at kind of learning on the fly and being like, right, well, we're trying to debug this issue and we're trying to figure stuff out. Maybe we're reading in the background and we're doing this and we're sharing ideas, and so there is an absolute ton of learning that happens in that world. And then likewise, you get like bystanders who will come in on, a Monday after an incident's happened at a weekend, and they get to see that someone's dealt with an incident. They can jump in and read about that. And so whether there was a meeting or whether there was a document, like it doesn't really matter that much. Like you've got the basics in place by having a good process that everyone can kind of follow along with. You are actively learning. So yeah, see this a lot. And this isn't to say that like running a sort of post-incident process isn't important. We have an entire team that is staffed around like making this a great part of the overall incident sort of end-to-end process for us. But it's just a little bit, I think, narrow to look at a document in a meeting as the kind of the signals of learning that happens here. And so my kind of like overarching thing here is, right, if you are doing, even if you are doing incident debriefs that are box checking exercises that you feel terrible about and don't feel like they're actually that useful, it's kind of fine if you feel like you're actually getting the value out of learning from incidents that are happening live. So basically, don't feel bad, don't stress out about this stuff.
So how do we think about learning from incidents at Incident IO?
Yeah, so I guess Instant.io is actually a pretty small company by like our customer standards. So we're 65-ish people with about 30 in engineering, which is much smaller than sort of like the average Instant.io customer. And I think that's broadly because our software is a lot more valuable when you have many more people and you have sort of coordination problems and sort of trying to shoot for like consistency and response and having a level playing field for everyone in the org to get onto becomes a lot more important. And so when I look at like how does Incident IO sort of think about learning from incidents, I guess there's a couple of things. First of all, we declare a lot of incidents, so we have lowered the bar massively for what we'd consider an incident. So any bug, any kind of customer issue, irrespective of whether it's one customer or 100 customers, if it needs to be sort of picked up urgently, we declare that as an incident down to like very low severity, but we have very, very many of those as a result. And so we've had like thousands of incidents that we have declared through the platform, which sounds a little scary. But as I said, when you start thinking that most of those are completely inconsequential, minor UI hiccups for one customer potentially, it sounds a little less bad. But when it comes to actually learning, we first of all don't do that many postmortems or incident debrief meetings. They tend to be slightly heavyweight for a company of our size. So if I look at how a typical incident goes for a low severity one, might be a single person dealing with that, might be not be particularly ambiguous. So they've sort of figured stuff out and sort of worked through it. If there is any ambiguity, maybe they've pulled in some other people into the channel, and so there's sort of like some dynamic sort of discussion and figuring stuff out there. But given the volume, it's not practical for us to be doing like thorough sort of post-incident processes for all of those. For any critical, like so that our most severe of incidents, we do get people together in a room, and we do make sure that there is like an adequate amount of like oversight and sort of distribution of like knowledge and expertise to kind of make sure that we don't have those things going without the most of the team being socialized. But there is a very big messy middle where like the learning happens when folks go back to their desk and they're sat around together and talking about things, or someone happens to have seen something. It's a lot more kind of organic rather than forced by process type of thing. And it seems to be working. Like we don't have tons of sort of repeat incidents, and we don't have tons of incidents where folks are jumping into them and not knowing what they're doing. So would argue that it's kind of it's a good and kind of pragmatic approach for a company of our size.
So is that what you suggest folks who are struggling with the basics should do too?
Yeah, I think if people are struggling with the basics, I think honestly the number one thing to get in place is just like a sensible incident response process. I think, as I said, like there is a ton of value to be had by running a process consistently, making it easy for folks to do so, and making access to like the information, the data that comes out of those incidents, just like as easy as possible to consume. So yeah, that would be pretty similar. Obviously layering on a bunch of like business context, some of that stuff isn't quite so simple. So you take an organization that is has a bunch of like process in place through like either self-imposed like policies and procedures and things like that, or an organization that is maybe regulated, right, where they have to do things a certain way. Things get a little more complicated, and it's harder to sort of start with the absolute basics. But yeah, generally speaking, I think like my advice to anyone who's sort of struggling to get things off the ground a little bit or struggling to make changes is to start like unbelievably simply and just get something out the door and sort of figure things out as you go.
I look at a feature like Insights that's focused on learning from incidents to make meaningful improvements to how teams manage incidents. So, what advice would you give to teams to balance this helpful feature with not getting too caught up in the metrics that it provides?
Yeah, like our insights product is sort of designed to, I guess, give access to incidents kind of in aggregate generally. So it's like from the very, very basic end, like how do I see how many incidents I'm having, what type of incident, where are they happening, which teams are most impacted, which people are most involved in those. That's sort of like base level things. Also give access to things like, how many aggregate like people hours are we spending in incidents? Does that show anything around like spikes where we maybe have like lack of like understanding and knowledge and things like that? So that would be useful. But like my general sort of like point that I would always say to people when it comes to looking at like incident data and aggregate is using it as like a starting point for an investigation is just helpful and useful as a way to kind of like pull the signal out of the noise. It's not feasible to go through every single incident all the time for most organizations and try and sort of figure these things out from sort of like looking at each one individually. So being able to look at them and go, well, why is there a spike in the amount of time that we're spending in these incidents? Oh, I can see, well, all these incidents have had like 3 people in them when maybe they could just have one person in them because they're very sort of trivial minor things. Maybe that's some useful signal that someone is like undertrained or whatever else it might be. But yeah, using them as a starting point for an investigation makes a ton of sense. Using them as sort of like final kind of outputs to measure performance or sort of drive to a conclusion, it tends to not lead to anything particularly useful.
And finally, and probably the most important question, what's wrong with MTTR?
Yeah, MTTR, or mean time to recovery. This is kind of the measure of, if you take all of your incidents and you look at time that the impact started through to the time that you kind of recovered things, and then you average all those times out, like is it a useful metric to help you know whether you're sort of improving or not improving. So tends to get a lot of shade thrown on it. And so, in like one end of the spectrum, you have folks who are like, statistically, it's irrelevant. Central tendency measures like the mean tends not to be useful on skewed data where outliers can sort of pull things out. Like I get all that. Like my background is in maths. That was my degree that I did. And so yeah, valid concerns, I think. Also kind of measuring folks to that measure just tends not to be particularly useful. Like, if you had one bad incident and someone happened to, have not answered the page, which inflated it by an hour, for example, what conclusion do you draw by saying that your mean increased? Very little. And so there's a lot of people who get very, very sort of heated about MTTR. My viewpoint is slightly more nuanced in that I have never seen it be useful. I've never used it myself in any kind of meaningful capacity. I've kind of looked at it. There's a bunch of tools that will provide it, but I've also not actively seen it be harmful. And so I'm kind of like, I think it's the onus is on the folks who are trying to drive change to come up with something a little bit better, rather than just be like, you can't use that thing. So yeah, I think there's a ton of more interesting metrics, and we have a ton within the product. But fundamentally, I'm a little bit less kind of passionate about MTTR being a terrible thing. I just think it's like it's fine. It's not good. It's not bad.